This is Chapter 5, Section 3, The Golden Age of Greece. The main idea that we'll be addressing here is the rise of democratic principles, art forms, theater, things that made Athens its high point when it was at its high point of culture. It's not so much an interaction between different cultures as we're used to seeing in other sections, as an interaction between the culture of Athens at its time and how it's become an influence on the culture of our time. Why it matters now is because at its height, Greece, technically just Athens is what we're looking at, sets a lasting standard in arts, politics, literature, and philosophy that still influence today. Vocabulary for this section includes Pericles, direct democracy, Parthenon, classical art, tragedy, Aeschylus, I may be mispronouncing that one, the Oresteia, Sophocles, Oedipus, Antigone, comedy, Aristophanes, philosopher, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras. After the Persian Wars wound down and Athens began basically embezzling money from the Delian League, but before the Peloponnesian War started, where Sparta confronted Athens about this issue, a man rose to power in Athens named Pericles. During the time that he was in charge, the money that had been taken from the Delian League gets spent on Athens, on art, architecture, sculpture, plays, financing philosophers. This is also a time period where Athens turns to direct democracy, a rule by the people. Males 18 and over could vote, but basically everybody within that category could vote on everything. Perhaps one of the most famous things to have been made during this era was a temple to Athena in the Acropolis of Athens. It became known as the Parthenon. It was constructed by an architect named Phidias, who, as the story goes, embezzled some money of his own and left the project partially completed. Athens did complete the project, but Phidias had skipped town with the cash. Inside of it, it contained a statue of Athena, 30 feet tall, made of marble, gold, and ivory. The one in this picture is not the original, as that one was destroyed. It is a modern replica. The goal of statues at this time were graceful, strong, perfectly formed, no emotions in the expressions. This became known as classical art. This is important because later we will be discussing Hellenistic art, and when it comes time for the chapter test, you will need to be able to distinguish the two given a picture of a statue. Describe, is it Hellenistic, is it classical, and why? Another advancement of culture at this time was the Greek theater, divided into the categories of tragedy and comedy. Greek tragedies almost always came in sets of 3. This kind of sets the tradition for like movies today that come in trilogies. The tragedies tend to show how one person doing something evil kind of creates a domino effect. More things go bad, and so on, until the end of the play, where eventually something goes horribly wrong in a way that could have been prevented had it not been for all of the bad acts leading up to it. Kind of like a instant karma retribution type of a thing. Often the problem is one of the characters has a sense of hubris. Hubris to the Greeks was a matter of pride, self-importance, but taking it to the point that you commit criminal actions based on your own sense of self-importance. This is highlighted in red because it really should have been a vocabulary word but was not listed as one. You should probably treat it as if it was. One of the earliest writers of plays in Greece was Aeschylus. He wrote the Oresteia. The Oresteia is the only trilogy of tragedies from Greece of which we have all 3 parts. All of the other plays that we have, a piece is missing and we have to figure out what happened in it based on clues from the pieces we do have. More on that later. The Aeschylus play Oresteia, or set of plays Oresteia, is about Agamemnon. We mentioned him with the Trojan War. He was the Mycenaean king that allegedly sailed to Troy to help get Helen back. According to the Oresteia story, Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter for favorable winds for his ships because the gods are not smiling upon his voyage, basically. This upsets his wife. Upon his return to Mycenae from the Trojan War, his wife has taken on a new lover, and when he sits down to his bath, they come in and drown him in his own bathtub. The death of Agamemnon becomes a direct result of his sacrifice of his daughter, which creates the chain of events leading up to his own demise. Perhaps more famous, however, is the later writer Sophocles. He wrote a trilogy about a character named Oedipus, and in this one it's about escaping fate. Now, we don't have the first play in the series, only the other two, but from these two we can figure out what happened in the first, because they reference back to it quite often. In the first play, the king of Thebes is told that he would be killed by his own son. So when his son is born, he orders the son killed. The guard who was supposed to do it couldn't, leaves the son out in the woods to die. A farm family finds him, raises him, and then Oedipus, the son who is now being raised, receives a prophecy of his own that he will kill his own father and marry his own mother. To avoid this, he leaves home, not realizing that the parents he's been living with are adopted. On the road, he meets his true father. They get into an argument, and, not knowing who it is, Oedipus kills him. Coming on Thebes, Oedipus, not knowing that the crying widow he meets is his own mother, mourning the man he just killed, falls in love and gets married to his own mom. This moves on to the second play, Oedipus Rex, in which Oedipus, as king of Thebes, is facing a plague in the city that's killing people. The gods are upset. He has to figure out why. He is told that they have a criminal in their midst who is committing incest and who killed his own family. Now, Oedipus does not realize he is the criminal. In order to appease the gods, he swears that he will find the man and punish him most severely for doing so. It is only at the end of the play that he finds out he is the man that he's been hunting. The mother/wife commits suicide, and Oedipus has his own eyes gouged out as penance, retribution, for his acts of sin in being married to his own mother and killing his own father. The third book picks up with his daughter Antigone. After having his eyes put out, Oedipus left his friend Creon in charge. Creon, not crayons like Crayolas. Now, Creon's a decent king, not great, not too bad, but there's a rebellion breaking out because he's leaning towards the bad side of things. In the rebellion, two of Oedipus's sons kill each other. Well, they both die anyways. And what ends up happening is Creon orders the one that supported him, buried as a hero, the one that defied him, left for the birds to pick at. Now, Antigone can't bear having her brother, the one who betrayed Creon as part of the rebellion, left out for birds to pick at. But it's been made illegal under penalty of death to give him proper funeral. She breaks the law, gives him the funeral anyways. Creon finds out, orders whoever did it put to death. Antigone is set up to be stoned to death, and then Creon's son rushes out to save her because he's in love with her. Both of them get stoned to death together. Through Creon's hubris, his pride in being upset at the rebellion being defied, he ends up inadvertently ordering the death of his own son. This is the tragic twist on it. Now, the Greeks had their sense of humor as well. One of their comedy writers was Aristophanes. Perhaps one of his more famous works was Lysistrata, the idea of the Peloponnesian War, Athens fighting Sparta, and the women of both towns decide to go on a strike and refuse to give their husbands sex until they declare peace. As you can probably picture, this makes for some very bizarre situations between the women and the husbands, especially when the women of Athens withdraw to the Acropolis, fortify themselves in, and defend it against their husbands' would-be attacks. This was also the period of the philosophers, the lovers of knowledge. Phileo literally meaning love, Sophia meaning knowledge in Greek. So philosophers, lovers of knowledge. The most well-known were the sophists. They were basically the hired teachers throughout Athens. One philosopher from this time period was Socrates. He was a sculptor, a pottery maker if I remember correctly, a philosopher, and he didn't like the sophists. He believed knowledge should be free, not paid for. He developed the idea of the Socratic method, asking questions to seek answers. He was anti-authority, and he ends up getting accused of corrupting the youth of Athens who would gather around in the marketplace and listen to him. His death sentence was to drink poison tea called hemlock. As he was dying, however, in his search for knowledge, Socrates actually goes so far as to analyze his own death, describing the symptoms to his students so that they can learn from his experience. One student of Socrates was Plato. Plato believed only the educated should be rulers. He did not like the idea that people who were not wise could be in charge. He wanted to limit it in an oligarchy style, a select group, only the educated. He also believed that our world was just a reflection of the ideal world, like somewhere out there was this perfect world and we were a bad copy of it. He drew an analogy called the allegory of the cave, in which he tells a story to explain his view of this. The idea of men raised from birth in a cave where all they ever see are shadows on the wall, and they begin to think this is their entire reality. To him, reaching enlightenment, understanding, was like being taken out of that cave and shown the real world. But then also it was like being put back in the cave and trying to describe what you had seen to the people who had never seen it. They wouldn't believe you. And to him, this was like a person who was enlightened trying to explain to the unenlightened what the reality was. Plato in turn became the teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle thought that, unlike Plato's ideal world that we were trying to discover, that studying our world was the only thing that could reveal truth. He's basically the great-grandfather of the scientific method. He was considered an expert on ethics, basically morality, politics, poetry, astronomy, geology, biology, physics, you name it, he was considered an expert on it. So much so that he actually ends up being the teacher of Alexander the Great. Of course, the name that most students are going to be familiar with is going to be Pythagoras. Not from Pythagoras himself, but from the Pythagorean theorem in the math classes. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Most of you are familiar with that, I'm sure. He believed that the entire universe could be broken down to the idea of music and numbers. In addition to doing the math that you're stuck having to study, he was able to travel through places, see sights, make music. Every stringed instrument I can think of is based on discoveries by Pythagoras. The idea that certain lengths of strings at certain vibrations can cause certain sounds. The whole concept of how a guitar works is pressing down on the string to artificially shorten the length on the side that you are vibrating in order to create different sound. And this is done at increments according to Pythagoras' measurements.